May your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen.
Minister statements. Minister statements. Minister responsible for status of women.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to acknowledge one-year anniversary of the release of the final report on the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. The previous minister responsible for status of women, the Honourable Caroline Cochrane, tabled the report entitled Reclaiming Power and Place in the Legislative Assembly on June the 4th, 2019. The report is split into 2 volumes with 3 main sections. Section 1 represents a comprehensive person and community-centered understanding of the crisis of violence experienced by Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQ+ persons. Section 2 takes a deeper look at the topics that present distinct issues or perspectives. It also describes opportunities to demonstrate within a distinctions-based approach how cultural, health, security, and justice can create a particular challenge for specific groups, institutions, geographies, and other circumstances. Section 3 focuses on different models of healing and Indigenous-led best practices. The report ends with the presentation of the 231 calls for justice, covering a wide range of topics and themes, including culture, health, and wellness, and human security. The Government of the Northwest Territories prepared an initial response to the calls of justice entitled Doing Our Part. While the N.W.T did not respond to specific calls for justice in Doing Our Part, we did provide a list of thematic sections related to each of the calls for justice, lightening the work we're already doing or can build upon. We also set out a number of high-level questions that will need to be considered more fully by our government. Then Minister Caroline Cochrane tabled this report in the Legislative Assembly on August the 22nd, 2019. To date, the N.W.T remains the only jurisdiction in Canada that has prepared a response to the final report. The Government in Northwest Territories has also made a commitment to work with Canada on the development of a national action plan in a coordinated manner that involves all stakeholders. The Minister of Crown Indigenous Affairs had committed to having the National Action Plan developed by June 2020. While that deadline has been pushed back due to circumstances relating to the COVID-19, the Government in Northwest Territories remains committed to working to move this work forward. The N.W.T has set up an interdepartmental working group for missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls to coordinate our response to the calls for justice. This working group is chaired by the Special Advisor to the Minister responsible for status of women and includes appointed representatives from the Department of Executive and Indigenous Affairs, Health and Social Services, Justice, Housing Corporation, and Education, Culture, and Employment. Other departments are invited to meetings or asked for input as required. Mr. Speaker, the N.W.T is aware that we cannot do this work alone. Our government is committed to working with all Northerners and partners across Canada to support the work needed to address systematic causes of violence, inequality, and racism, so that Indigenous girls, women, 2S LGBTQ+ people are able to feel safe and empowered in our territory and also in our country. According to Stats Canada, the Northwest Territories has the second highest rate of violence against women in the country. As a government, we need to take the necessary steps to address the systematic causes of violence, inequality, and racism that contribute to the problem in the Northwest Territories. The final report shares stories we all need to hear, stories about someone's sister, someone's niece, someone's mother, someone's child. Sadly, Indigenous women and girls in the Northwest Territories continue to live these stories. Try to put the pain that loved ones and communities deal with into perspective is difficult. The Northwest Territories may be large geographically, but the events in one community can affect us all. This is why it's so important that we work together to address what's the ongoing violence being experienced by Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQ+ people. It will require many people willing to work together to explore ways in which we can end violence that continues to have a negative impact on the lives of many Northwest Territories residents. I recognize that change will not happen overnight, but change must happen. Mr. Speaker, violence against women, Indigenous girls, 2S LGBTQ+ people is not an individual problem or an issue only for certain communities. This violence is rooted in systematic factors woven into the fabric of Canadian society like economic, social, political marginalization, as well as racism, discrimination, and misogyny. As the previous minister responsible for status of women, the Equality put it, and I quote, "We must keep this issue at the forefront of people's minds and consistently convey another truth, that Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQ+ individuals are valued, loved, and worthy of justice." To conclude, Mr. Speaker, I would like to acknowledge the courage and the strength shown by those who agreed to share their truths with the National Commission. I offer my thoughts and prayers and my gratitude. Kuinaini Masi, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statements. Member for Nivik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 1 year ago I sat in the front row at the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, Quebec, while the report for the missing and murdered Indigenous women was presented to the Prime Minister. Although he didn't use the term genocide that day, he told a crowd the next day in Vancouver, "We accept the findings, including what happened amounts to genocide." Mr. Speaker, the families and lost loved ones were acknowledged that day for the injustices against them. Last week, we learned that the federal action plan in response to this missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls final report has been delayed. Minister Bennett citing due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Speaker, while I can certainly appreciate that we've all been busy dealing with this pandemic, I must say I was terribly disappointed and I was insulted to hear the news of this delay for a national action plan and using COVID-19 as an excuse. Mr. Speaker, they have had 10 months since they received the report, and it's not as if they had not heard the requests over and over again. Mr. Speaker, the families and the victims across the country have fought hard to ensure that a national plan would be developed and that governments would implement the calls for justice outlined in the final report and take steps towards real, lasting positive change. One aspect to this change was the federal government to develop this national action plan. Mr. Speaker, this delay in the development of the action plan concerns me deeply. We as Canadians, as a government, as an Indigenous woman, as a mother, as an aunt of Indigenous women and girls, cannot afford any more delays when it comes to the safety and protection of our women and girls and 2S LGBTQIA people. I truly hope that the Prime Minister will rethink this delay and give our women and girls and everyone waiting for this action plan the respect and justice that they deserve. Mr. Speaker, I urge this government to push the federal government to develop an action plan now, not later. And Mr. Speaker, while this is occurring, I fully expect and encourage this government not to wait and to develop our own action plan and lead the way and make this a reality. As I mentioned, we cannot afford to wait any longer, have any more blood on our hands, lose any more loved ones, violence in our homes and our communities, silence of the issues of our Indigenous women and girls and 2S LGBTQIA face at the rate higher than anyone else in Canada that will continue as a result of not implementing the calls for justice. And Mr. Speaker, I will keep this issue at the forefront for everyone, in everyone's mind, and I will have questions for the Minister responsible for status of women. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Nivik-Twin Lakes. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Haver South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have noticed on social media the availability of Indigenous traditional artisan products has diminished, and I'm not sure why this is. For myself, I do not have the talent or vision that these traditional artisans possess. However, the creativity of these artisans truly amazes me. It is important that this government provide meaningful support to the artisans of the N.W.T. Not only do they create beautiful products, they keep Indigenous history alive. Mr. Speaker, over the years I've had the privilege of meeting many of the artisans whose creations are displayed not only in this building, but in buildings throughout the N.W.T, Canada, and the world. Many artisans attend my office. I'm always grateful to listen and talk with them. Many of them are unassuming and go about their business, but are always willing to share their stories. You can sense the passion as they discuss their creations. They want you to know who they are as an Indigenous person. They want you to know the cultural significance of keeping their artistry alive. For Indigenous peoples, education means much more than sitting in a classroom. It includes developing on-the-land knowledge and preserving artistic traditions through art. Many people appreciate the work created by the Indigenous peoples of the N.W.T, and it is sought after by many collectors throughout the world. There are many that may not appreciate the time, work, and passion that go into each creation, and we have a responsibility to change that line of thinking. Mr. Speaker, I am very concerned that this creativity will be lost if we do not seriously address some of the shortcomings with respect to the support we provide. Artisans are willing to pass their knowledge on to their children, grandchildren, and others. It is these artisans that need our support. This government, in cooperation with Indigenous governments, needs to take a collaborative approach with the artisans to ensure this history and art is not lost. Mr. Speaker, it is time for all governments in the N.W.T to engage with those in the communities who are keeping Indigenous culture and history alive. What better time to support our artisans while developing our youth who may be out of school for an extended period due to COVID-19? With school out, let's take this opportunity to expand our artisan base by teaching our youth. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Haver South. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Tunade-Welday.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for my member statement today, I'd like to take the time here to thank all my constituents in my riding in Tunade-Welday. Mr. Speaker, COVID-19 has caused a lot of grief and disruptions for people all across this country, and the North is no different. But we are, as I mentioned before, we as Northerners are resilient, and we came together and helped those who are in need and made sure that our basic necessities were all covered. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to personally thank all the chiefs and councils of my riding, and please forgive if I leave anybody out. I want to recognize the chief and councils of Dilo, Detta, N.W.T, and Lutz-Lake. I also want to thank all the Métis leadership, the Hamilton Fort Resolution, along with the Mayor, Pat Simon, and his staff, as well as a big thank you to some companies such as the N.W.T Dev Corp, Dennis Stone Corporation, and Detoncho Corporation, and its subsidiary companies, for helping to give back to the community. Mr. Speaker, there have also been a number of private citizens who stepped up during this pandemic, and for example, I'll give some names to put some to this, is Joanne Seta of the YELLOWKNIFE First Nation for donating food hampers in Dilo and Detta, and Lutz-Lake, people like Gloria Shearing, Sinise Catholic, and Becky Roderick Basil, who all worked on monthly food hampers. And in N.W.T, Bessan Mackay, who worked tirelessly to help maintain community morale by hosting a talent show on Facebook. And I think the talent show reminds us it's important to keep us entertained, laughing, and remain in good spirits as we can. And laughing is the best medicine. In our language, we call it 19 because laughter is the best medicine, really is. And let's not forget that. And through that, I just have some questions later on for Madam Premier regarding the funding of checkpoints in N.W.T. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Tunade-Welday. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Decho.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to point out that the Minister of Health and Social Services filed away my health care services issues letter and notified the House yesterday of such. I am disappointed to say the least, specifically disappointment to the residents of the Northwest Territories that no actions will be taken to address health center concerns. I did receive a copy of that letter dated June 1st after answering my question about the healthcare services in my community of Fort Providence. Those questions were raised on February 28, 2020, related to my member's statement, the same concern. Mr. Speaker, my member's statement at the time was a concern that patients were being misdiagnosed for their ailments. There had to have been a level of misdiagnosis if patients kept going back to the health center 3, 4, and even 5 times for the same ailment. Each time they were given a pill and sent home. Only when their condition was at a critical stage, then the medevac crew were summoned. I know of one instance where a patient never came home alive. God bless her soul. My question raised at the time was, does the department conduct investigations into complaints made against health center staff? And the reply from the minister was, absolutely, we do. Mr. Speaker, during a recent Committee of the Whole session with Health and Social Services, I stated the same issues and the fact that a formal complaint was made to the Registered Nurses Association of the Northwest Territories and Nunavut. And I should note, the complaint at the time was copied to the Health and Social Services Chief Executive Officer. The CEO had requested a copy. This was back in November 2019, and to date, nothing has come of it. The Health and Social Services does have a copy of all the complaints. The only ones they don't have are all the other complaints sent to Renant New and to the chair of the Health Leadership Council. It was at this forum, at Committee of the Whole, that we understood that Health and Social Services was detached from Renant New. So there is no mechanism in place to follow up on complaints made to anyone. I believe this is a very serious problem within the department and needs to be addressed. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Decho. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Thabacha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in any normal given year, by this point in time, the government of the Northwest Territories would have already hired hundreds of students within the summer student employment program, employing students all across the territory from mid-April until the end of August. However, COVID-19 has derailed virtually all employment opportunities that would normally be afforded to our northern student population. Mr. Speaker, according to a News North article from May 18, 2020, the government of the Northwest Territories has so far only hired 98 summer students for the 2020 year. That is quite a difference from 351 who were hired in 2019, or the 344 in 2018, or the 306 in 2017. The reason for this hiring shortfall is because of the decision by the Department of Finance to initiate a hiring freeze for summer students due to COVID-19 disruptions. Mr. Speaker, as we approach Phase 2 of Emerging Wisely, I would certainly hope that our government makes it a priority to increase and to fast-track the number of students hired for summer 2020. COVID-19 or not, our students need to continue to be supported with employment opportunities and work experience. All N.W.T students, whether high school aged, those of Aurora College, or those returning from southern institutions, they all deserve equal employment opportunities as residents of the N.W.T. I will have questions for the Minister responsible for Human Resources later today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Nunavut.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, emerging wisely across our territory. The Chief Public Health Officer recommended residents of Northwest Territory spend time out in the land to reduce the risks of exposure to COVID-19, Mr. Speaker. That part of that emerging plan wisely, current COVID-related health restrictions also to strengthen family bonds, to improve mental health, to participate in traditional lifestyle out in the land. The schools are closed. Hunting season's going on right now with geese hunting back home and fishing. The season started. Dr. Condo's orders to spend time on the great outdoors. However, that costs money, Mr. Speaker. People in our communities spend 3 times as much more for gas or food to go out and sustain themselves out in the land while hunting traditional foods. Mr. Speaker, remote communities in Nunavut would pay like $1.71 for gasoline, and it's $1.17 here. So many, it all adds up. Our community harvester assistance funding to local communities, to renewable resources councils, assist local hunters and trappers to defray the capital operating costs in their harvesting activities. Mr. Speaker, I'm seeing if people across our territory will be, since we're still under COVID-19, now it's going into summer, in regards to that, are we going to be getting any more assistance from the federal government for funding for traditional hunting and keeping people out in the land at their cabins so they won't get sick of COVID-19? Alternatively, additional funding can provide for community governance through the municipal and community affairs to provide assistance for the neediest residents to get outside. Mr. Speaker, I will have questions for the Premier later today. Thank you.
Thank you, member for Nunavut. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. On April 22nd, 6 Dominion Diamond affiliates applied for creditor protection in Alberta. I will not speak to the merits or details of this proceeding, but it does raise serious concerns and issues for the Northwest Territories, as the Acadie mine is a major employer and economic driver here in the Northwest Territories. Creditor protection has been extended until at least June 1st, 2020. According to the list of unsecured creditors, Dominion Diamond owes N.W.T businesses over $13 million, much of this to Indigenous Economic Development Corporations. The pension fund for the unionized employees is also in a deficit of over $20 million. To say all of this has serious implications for the N.W.T economy would be an understatement. N.W.T holds $295 million in financial security for the closure and reclamation obligations at Acadie mine. Almost all of this is in the form of surety bonds issued by insurance companies rather than irrevocable letters of credit issued by Canadian chartered banks. These surety bonds are a relatively new and untested form of financial security for the Northwest Territories. Until regular MLAs asked, there was virtually no communications from Cabinet on what N.W.T is doing or not. It was not clear that N.W.T is participating in a legal proceeding, and if so, to what ends, until the ITI Minister responded to questions yesterday in this House. It has not been publicly reported whether N.W.T is owed any money from the operation and production at the Acadie mine. I have asked about the financial security that is in place and continue to have concerns about its adequacy. I'll have questions later today for the Premier, as this matter cuts across several portfolios. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we return to this House in the midst of the COVID-19, I can start to feel something in the air again, Mr. Speaker, and that is the entrenchment of the status quo creeping back in. However, Mr. Speaker, when you are in the eye of a hurricane, you often can't feel the whiplash around you. And Mr. Speaker, I can feel a sense of complacency sneaking into this House. Mr. Speaker, there will be another wave of COVID-19. We are heading into one of the largest depressions in any of our lifetimes. Mr. Speaker, let's not also forget that we are in the midst of a climate emergency, which will cost alone on our infrastructure billions of dollars, which we do not have, Mr. Speaker. I know there are problems in the North, and often you can simply look at these problems and they can seem insurmountable, so it's best to just push them aside. However, Mr. Speaker, we cannot let that mentality creep back in. During our COVID-19 response, I was truly honored to be a part of this government. I was passionate, and I saw a government that moved quickly, although not perfectly. And I believe this should be our government motto. Mr. Speaker, the quest for protection is a false one. And as the bureaucratic trenches and thinking and processes are pulling us all back in, and the risk aversion that has plagued this government for decades is re-emerging, we must resist it. Mr. Speaker, I see the old and tired political debates start to divide us again. I see the same decisions to do nothing start to be made again. I see minister statements resorting to platitudes once again, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my dream is that I could sit in this House and I could be a Conservative. I could sit over here and I could have ministers and I could say, whoa, slow down. Did you think about that? What are you doing? Did you plan that out? But instead, on this side of the House, we repeatedly asked for things, and we were repeatedly told, no, Mr. Speaker, no, we can't do that.
No.
I honestly don't believe any one of us ran to implement a department strategic plan. We were passionate, and we were all excited MLAs. I've seen the response to COVID bring that out. And Mr. Speaker, now is not the time to become complacent. Now is the time to make quick and brash decisions that may not be perfect, but they will get us through the impending crises that we have to come. Mr. Speaker, I believe we can do this. I believe we can bring the people of the Northwest Territories together to overcome the challenges, but let us not become complacent simply because the weather is nice outside. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, because of the swift collective response from this government and the people of the Northwest Territories, COVID-19 has not taken the life of a single Northerner. Sadly, the same cannot be said for Indigenous women and girls. Today, I stand in solidarity with advocate, colleague, and my friend MLA Inuvik Twin Lakes in condemnation of the number of Indigenous women and girls that have gone missing or been murdered in this country. Almost 2,400 Canadians shared their personal gut-wrenching stories for the June 2019 Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls report, believing their pain would spark action and change. 1 year later, the federal government has announced its response will be late. Mr. Speaker, we have lost an entire year of action. We must demand change now. While we are focused on the response to COVID and with achieving the priorities we have set out for this Assembly, the genocide of Indigenous women and girls cannot be allowed to continue in the face of inaction. We cannot wait for COVID to end, and we cannot wait for the federal government. We must take action today. There are calls for justice within the report that we can accomplish now. We need to just start, just begin, Mr. Speaker. I'm urging the Premier and her Cabinet to take all necessary steps to start implementing the calls for action without further delay. Examples might include Action 1.8 that calls on governments to create specific and long-term funding available to Indigenous communities and organizations to create, deliver and disseminate prevention programs, education and awareness campaigns designed for Indigenous communities and families related to violence prevention and combating lateral violence. Action 2.7 that calls on all governments to adequately fund and support Indigenous-led initiatives to improve the representation of Indigenous peoples in media and pop culture. Or Action 3.5 that calls on all governments to establish culturally competent and responsive crisis response teams in all communities and regions to meet the immediate needs of Indigenous people, family and communities after a traumatic event. Action 5.8 that calls on all provincial and territorial governments to enact missing persons legislation. Mr. Speaker, this government represents a population that is 50% Indigenous. I believe that puts an additional onus on us to show leadership to the rest of Canada on this issue. Implementing the calls to action, even in the midst of this pandemic, will demonstrate that the N.W.T truly cares about the health and wellness of all its residents, regardless of the threat. If we are truly actively listening and want change, Mr. Speaker, then we must respond now.
Thank you, member for Kamloops. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Mumphy.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Bishopcone and Yellowknife. Few communities in the Northwest Territories are more closely linked than Bishopcone and Yellowknife. This shows the flow of vehicles between them. Daily, hundreds of cars and trucks make the hour journey in both directions. At any given time, the number of travelers can exceed the entire population of hamlet of Fort Liard. Yet, in this interconnected age, Mr. Speaker, when those drivers leave their municipalities, the boundaries, they're on their own. There is no cell phone coverage in that area between Bishopcone Junction and Yellowknife. In an event of emergency, an accident or a breakdown, which we've seen in the past, or a death from community members, there is no way of calling for help. Mr. Speaker, we're talking about one of the busiest, most accident-prone roads in the territory. There are communication towers throughout the Highway 3 corridor, yet Ironically, no cell coverage. The phone company simply cannot be bothered. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to find out what the minister responsible for either infrastructure or finance can do about this intolerable situation. Mr. Speaker, I have questions for the appropriate department at a later time. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Mumfway. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. Oral questions. Member for N.W.T.
Mr. Speaker, my emerging wisely across the Northwest Territories, has the N.W.T considered providing additional funding through Community Harvesters Assistance Program or other means to assist families to go and get out on the land? And I'll ask Madam Premier. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So my understanding is that ENR will be looking at the monies that they give for the harvesting program, the harvesting assistance program, to see what they can do to support it. But there's also other funding that has come in. Indigenous governments were given money for through the federal government for COVID-19. Health and Social Services gave money for At Home on the Land initiative to Indigenous governments, and there may be some flexibility within other programs as well. So there's various streams of monies that are coming for the Indigenous governments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm really happy to hear that. I need to know, like, it was all front-end loaded in regards to when this happened, and everybody, all the money was flowing in regards to for the communities and into our local for the Inuvialuit, which in everybody got their funds to go get out in the land. But now, I guess we're mid-COVID. Is there any more funding that's going to be announced to our local communities or to our local hunters and trappers and harvesters? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for N.W.T. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As spoken, we are in the process, ENR is in the process of reviewing the Harvester Assistance Program to see how we can make that more flexible. But the key thing is that the Indigenous governments did receive federal money. I don't know, Mr. Speaker, how much that was. Respectfully, it was given directly to the Indigenous governments. But my understanding from the department is that the federal government is looking at perhaps supporting more money to the Indigenous governments for COVID-19. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think they ran out of money. Even the modest bump in funding, Mr. Speaker, would help our community and lowest income people that need to get out in the land. The N.W.T has done analysis to determine how much funding would be needed to assist residents to comply with public health orders to getting them back out in the land and supporting them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for N.W.T. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Absolutely, any Indigenous governments that needs help in any areas, if it's within our powers as the government of the Northwest Territories, then definitely we would be willing to sit down with them to help them to fill out applications, to understand the processes, to find out where resources are. Call and we will answer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for N.W.T.
I have your cell phone number. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I just, I really am thankful for that. The Premier committing to help and assist in making sure that the Cabinet and herself commit to getting additional funding to might be available for this coming summer as soon as possible, because we're still in the midst of COVID-19, we're still in the pandemic. People still are still really scared, in regards to COVID-19, and just making sure that they're taken care of. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. More of a comment. Would you like to respond, Honourable Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Absolutely, like I said, our job is, especially with Indigenous affairs, is to help the Indigenous governments. But I do need to clarify that the Indigenous governments, and I'm very respectful of them, have asked me to not interfere with their federal funding, that they wanted it to directly. And I have advocated and lobbied the federal government that that money should go directly to the Indigenous governments. So it's a fine line. I'm careful of how I lobby. I'll lobby for additional money, but I won't ask where, how much, or who, to who, because I think we're crossing the line at that point. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as we enter Phase 2 of Emerging Wisely, I would like to know if the Minister has plans to end the hiring freeze and hire more summer students this year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for Human Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, it's not so much that there was a hiring freeze, but the program that is administered by the Department of Finance certainly did put a hold on new offers to students. Any offers that were in place, those ones have been honoured and those students have been employed. The reality was, Mr. Speaker, that bringing on several hundred new employees at a time when our own employees are struggling to adapt to the current conditions and now are having to be asked to find a way to slowly return back to their workplaces. This is not a time to be bringing on a large group of new students. It's not only about supporting them financially. We want to ensure that when they're coming to work as summer students and interns for the N.W.T, that they're getting a meaningful and positive experience. And right now, Mr. Speaker, the priority has to be on ensuring the safety and well-being of all of our own staff, ensuring the safety and well-being of the people that we serve, and it's not a time, unfortunately, when we can bring on a large number of students. So that said, Mr. Speaker, if there are departments, boards and agencies who have the capacity to hire a student and want to hire a student, they can come to the Department of Finance and indicate that. There's not a set freeze per se. If there's a match that can be made, then the student can still be hired. It's just that at this point, as far as a formal program, this isn't the time. There is also the casual pool, and to the extent that students want to apply to the casual pool, there certainly are positions available, frankly, as a result of COVID, that can be filled from that pool. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, would the Minister commit to prioritize the hiring of summer students wherever possible across the government of the Northwest Territories?
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for Human Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I know it's not popular, but I can't make that commitment right now. I can't make the commitment to hire students specifically. What I can say is that, again, there is the casual pool that I would certainly encourage the students to apply to. There are positions that need to get filled. There are tasks that need to get done, in large part arising from the needs of our COVID-19 response. And while that's not exclusive to students, those positions are there, and we would certainly want the students to put their names into that casual pool if available. At that point, the hiring process undergoes the usual processes that it does within Human Resources. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, I think a positive message is important to the students of the Northwest Territories. What message does the Department of Human Resources have for the Territory students who have missed out on potential job opportunities by the Government of the Northwest Territories this year? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for Human Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I share the view that there should be a positive message in all of this. COVID-19 has been a very unique and unprecedented challenge. At the risk of saying what is being said department after department about the nature of this being unprecedented. For the students who aren't going to be getting the positions that they wanted or hoped for, again, if they are able to get a position through the casual pool, they will undoubtedly get an experience unlike anything they were otherwise going to get prior to the pandemic. If they don't get hired hired? Well, Mr. Speaker, again, we do have a number of strong different programs in place to hire students when they do return back to the Northwest Territories after their schooling. The federal government does have a program in place right now to encourage students to go out and firstly to have private hiring with companies, but also to go out and do works and public works and volunteer type services. So I'd encourage students to go and to look into that. And the last option, Mr. Speaker, again, as someone as a human resources, is go out and build your resume in a way that maybe doesn't involve a formal employment. There's a lot of people out there who need help right now, and I know that's not the kinds of funding that students want to get, but it's just not the right time for the human resources to be rolling out those programs. But we are still going to be here looking for students to come back to the North as this pandemic passes us by. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, as our government prepares for the second wave of COVID-19 and for future pandemics, will the Department of Human Resources commit to making a contingency plan for the future that is more mindful of summer student employment? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for Human Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I can certainly say that the Department of Human Resources will be looking at all of the programs that rolled out, looking at the way in which we supported our employees and looking at the returning to work plans that we have, ensuring that, so frankly, it's beyond simply looking at students, but looking at the way in which Human Resources was responding to the pandemic. So that we will undertake that project and in order to be even better prepared for whatever emergencies we may face going forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Sir. Oral questions. Member for Haverhill South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've got questions for the Minister of ITI. Can the Minister tell me what is the departmental budget for assisting artisans working from home, more specifically those that create artwork and traditional crafts? Also, is there an equity requirement to access grants, and is a requirement to have a business license? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Haverhill South. Minister responsible for Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, ITI supports the business of art to the tune of $1.6 million every year for a variety of projects. Our regional program delivery routinely includes support for the marketing, promotion, and delivery of arts initiatives. In addition to providing funding support, our regional offices provide regular marketing support for artists, such as making business cards, helping them to update online profiles, and assisting during craft fairs in a non-COVID era. We have a micro-business program under SEED that provides funds to purchase materials up to $5,000 over 3 years, and no business license is required, just proof that they are commercial artists. Recently, we provided artists the opportunity to take advantage of the Creative Industries Economic Recovery Funding. We are now considering these proposals. Up to $3,000 is being made available to successful Northwest Territories artists or commercial film and media arts producers. Up to $5,000 is being made available to successful and registered Northwest Territories arts businesses, non-for-profit organizations, and collectives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Haverhill South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure if I have any more questions after that. Anyways, the main issue for artisans in the South Slave is access to materials such as beads, stroud, and more importantly, naturally tanned moose hide. This government has talked about a tannery building for a number of years, but this has not become a reality. I asked the Minister, is her department willing to identify and work with a proponent in the South Slave to build a tannery? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Haverhill South. Minister responsible for ITI.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, ITI is in the business of helping Northwest Territories businesses and the Northwest Territories economy grow and prosper. If a Northwest Territory resident has a legal and viable business plan and meets the required qualifications, ITI supports, programs and services are there to be accessed. When it comes to a tannery, I understand that there is an initiative being pursued by our South Slave Regional Office and a project that Fort Providence is leading. The department has supported a pre-feasibility and business plan for this work. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Haverhill South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's good to hear. I know that's been ongoing for several years, so hopefully it'll come to fruition. The next question, I guess, or comment, is in some of the regional and smaller communities, one issue that common theme is location where artisans can showcase and make their work available to the public. Fort Yard is a community that has a beautiful building where local art is showcased and placed for sale. We need that type of facility in every community. Will the minister commit her department to work with a community organization willing to provide space for artisans to work out of and showcase their art? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Haver South. Minister responsible for ITI.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. ITI and ECE share responsibility to support the arts and fine crafts. We are currently working with ECE to finalize an updated strategy to guide and inform our government's support of the arts sector in the future. We do have a variety of commercial operators who sell and showcase art. We also showcase regional artists in our artist displays at the airports and in our parks. I do commit to the member to having the conversation with my department about ensuring that there's commercial space in every community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Haver South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is important for Indigenous people to pass down traditional knowledge. Would the minister commit to work with the Minister of Education to support and develop a grant program beyond what is in place without an equity requirement to artisans willing to teach their children or grandchildren or extended family the craft? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Haver South. Minister responsible for ITI.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am certainly willing to follow up on this matter with the Minister of ECE. ITI and I personally recognize the value of our traditional arts and crafts. I've been supportive of our jewelry makers for quite a while now. So passing on the traditional knowledge is a very valuable and needed thing in the Northwest Territories, and I'm very happy to support initiatives like this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Ditcho.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hope I'm not crossing any lines or anything in my member statements and, and in my questioning regarding this sensitive nature of the subject that I bring up related to health centers' concerns, and if I do, I apologize to the House. Mr. Speaker, when complaints are not taken seriously by the Health and Social Services Department, I believe the residents of the Northwest Territories are in serious trouble, especially small communities with no doctors nor specialists. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is how serious is the Department to the serious health crisis concerns of the residents of my community and to the people of the Northwest Territories? Masi, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Ditcho. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Health and Social Service authorities have a complaints process in place where clients are encouraged to talk with their local healthcare or social service provider as the first step. If they're not satisfied, there's also a follow-up step with the regional quality representative. For serious private practice concerns, confidential investigations are carried out by the NTSSA with the support of the Department of Finance and Human Resource Department. So all investigations, principles of due process are followed to hear from everybody that's involved in the complaint, including the staff. So the employer can then determine what action is required to address the concerns. Complaints of misconduct can also be submitted to the complaints officer of the regulatory bodies for nurses, doctors, dentists, pharmacists, social workers, and midwives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Ditcho.
Masi, Mr. Speaker, and masi to the Minister for that answer. That's pretty much the standard process. And I believe we've gone beyond that. We've already filed a formal complaint. And there's been other formal complaints filed that have gone unheeded. Mr. Speaker, Northwest Territories residents, and especially the Indigenous residents of my community, should not be treated like the treatment they received at the local health center. They should also not be treated with racist overtones just for being Indigenous. Comments such as, just because you are a treaty and you Indians are a bunch of drunks, should never have to be heard. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister: when are you ever going to take the concerns of the residents seriously in regards to the complaints against the health center nursing staff? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Detroit. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I followed up with my department to confirm my understanding of the process. So unfortunately, because there was a complaint filed with the Nurses Association, it is not appropriate for the minister to meet and respond to the specifics of the complaint because I was told that we can't be seen as interfering in any judicial or quasi-judicial process that is currently underway. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Detroit.
Merci for that answer. I think we had this discussion already that there's a total disconnect by the department and the registered nurses group. That the N.W.T does the hiring of all nurses and doctors and whatnot, and they're passed over to RENATDU, their governing body. Once we've done that, there's a line severed right there. So they've got no control over any aspect of how they operate, those nurse practitioners and whatnot. And that's a big concern in our small communities. I don't know where the department does not have a mechanism in place to help the residents to address these issues. My question to the minister is, will she look into mechanisms to be put in place to help the residents of the Northwest Territories? Merci.
Thank you, Member for Detroit. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, quality of care. We are working with the way we change and provide services in order to ensure that the practices are respectful to the values of residents. Through primary healthcare reform, we are focusing on improving cultural and safety and relationship-based caring. And the members asking if we will commit to that relationship, absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Mumford.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the phone gets alarm.
Cell phones, Mr. Speaker. I spoke earlier about on member statement about the cell phone services between Betchacon and Yellowknife. We have no access to cell phone services between Betchacon and Yellowknife, and again, this is an ongoing issue. Because there's been some issues happens between Yellowknife and Betchacon and Yellowknife.
Talked about the safety when asked about the summer students. So I'll continue with the safety avenue on the Highway 3. Mr. Speaker, is the Minister of Finance aware of the number of people or of cars and trucks passing back and forth daily between Betchacon and Yellowknife? Just wondering if she's traveled Highway 3 lately, Mr. Speaker. Merci.
Thank you, Member for Mumford. Minister responsible for Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I can say certainly in the last 8 months or so I have not traveled that road, but in my past life for some 10 years I used to be on that road quite regularly attending court in Betchiko. So I am well aware that there are some spots where there simply is no coverage and it's a safety risk. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Mumfwey.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm glad that the Minister identified as a safety risk between Ray Junction and Yellowknife. So, Mr. Speaker, from a risk management point of view, what can the Minister tell us about the danger of leaving commuters and truckers without cell coverage along such an important stretch of the highway? We're talking about the safety of our N.W.T citizens, Mr. Speaker. Merci.
Thank you, Member for Mumfwey. Minister responsible for Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not a risk analyst, and I'm not going to pretend to provide to the House or to the people who are on that highway my own personal views on what is or isn't a risk or how much of a risk it is, but I do acknowledge the point that's being made that there are people on that highway. It's a stretch of highway where there's, while frequently traveled, still has lots of parts where there are risks in terms of there being a highway and there can be an accident, and then there's maybe no one there coming along who has a phone or a satellite phone. So I certainly acknowledge that that's a reality and that there's some obvious risks associated. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Mumfwey.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, next question I have is, would the Minister commit to calling Northwest Tel to convince the company to provide critical cell phone coverage that commuters and truckers need on the stretch of highway? One would assume that she has clout over her government, as government is Northwest Tel's biggest customer. Mr. Speaker, merci.
Thank you, Member for Mumfwey. Minister responsible for Finance.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I am certainly more than happy to phone Northwest Tel and have some engagement with them. In fact, I do think that's an easy yes. But as far as what I can or can't convince a private corporation to do, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to be in a position to say yes or to make any commitment in that regard. But certainly they're an important private sector partner in the Northwest Territories, and I'm sure they will want to have discussions and engagements with the N.W.T. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Mumfwey.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in that case, I'd like to ask this government what their action will be on this particular subject. Mr. Speaker, I was copied on a letter to the Minister of Infrastructure and ECE the other day, June 1st and 2nd, from both the Chief of Bishakon and N.W.T in full support of this cell phone coverage in that area. So, Mr. Speaker, if Northwest Tel won't do it, would the Minister of Infrastructure, Finance, in combination of both departments, commit to funding the extension of cell coverage to the Highway 3 corridor between Bishakon and Yellowknife? It's really badly needed now, Mr. Speaker. Merci.
Thank you, Member for Mumfwey. Minister responsible for Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are 3 priority needs that are related to broadband and telecoms that have been already identified for the N.W.T. The 5010 megabytes per second, that's the speed, which I know has been spoken of recently in the House. The importance of resiliency and redundancy in our networks, which hasn't come up here, but has certainly come up in the past in the House. But the third one is cell coverage. So I certainly want the member to know that I know that this is a priority. It's already a priority within my department, and as far as providing that as a service, that we have to increase the ability to have better cell coverage. I'm not in a position to say right now what we're going to do, but this is almost becoming a bit of a theme week for me that I hadn't expected, and it's very clear that we're going to have a very clear plan to achieve those 3 goals. They are, if ever it wasn't clear, then COVID-19 has made it very clear now how important those things are to being connected, whether it's education, health, or otherwise. So, Mr. Speaker, I certainly do expect that I'll be making faster progress on this than maybe what would have happened before COVID. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Nivik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As per my member statement, I know I get very emotional. Whenever I talk about the missing and murdered Indigenous women, I remember the stories, I see their faces, and so, you know, it's never going to leave me. Mr. Speaker, as mentioned in my member statement, I would like to ask the minister responsible for status of women what the federal delay in development of a national action plan to address the calls for justice outlined in the MMIWG final report means for the N.W.T. in terms of development of our own action plan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Twin Lakes. Minister responsible for status of women.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to be fair to the federal government and acknowledge that the work has been happening, but there are times like this through the COVID-19 where events have not been able to take attention to or have been slowed. Of course, the pandemic we've been facing is a priority for all governments, and face-to-face meetings have not been available or planned after recent government transitions since the report was tabled last year. We would all like to see our work advance together so we can have the benefit of discussions and experiences from across the country. Having a national action plan provides the opportunity for more collaboration and leadership. This does not, however, prevent us from continuing our own work in the Northwest Territories and advance the calls for justice. We've been working internally on identifying further actions we require and will continue to implement them and engage with Indigenous governments, communities, and others as appropriate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I hear what the minister says, and I disagree, because with COVID, how many deaths have we had with COVID? We've had way more deaths with Indigenous women and girls, and it hasn't been taken as serious. Mr. Speaker, will the minister commit to developing an N.W.T. action plan to address these calls for justice without waiting for this federal action plan? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Twin Lakes. Minister responsible for status of women.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in my minister's statement, I mentioned that the Northwest Territories has been a leader in responding to the report, and I can commit to moving actions forward. My hesitation in suggesting that the Northwest Territories develop a wholly standalone plan is that we do not want to align in many cases with the expectations of Indigenous governments, communities, and particularly Indigenous women and girls. This requires collaboration, and much of that is occurring in the discussion happening throughout the development of this National Action Plan. I believe the inquiry recommended a National Action Plan because it recognized that the scope of the issues identified requires Canadian society and all of Canada to be engaged. That said, we've already undertaken actions in response to the inquiry's report. In our initial response, doing our part, we identified things we're doing now, things we can do right away, and others we can continue to work on doing. In addition, interdepartmental working group was set up to coordinate the Government Northwest Territories' response to calls for justice, and this working group includes representatives from key departments, like I mentioned. They're also tasked with doing an in-depth review and analyze the calls for justice. I appreciate that the member does not want us to let the calls for justice found in the report to sit on the shelf and collect dust. We all need to continue our focus on making this change, but I don't think we need a separate standalone action plan to work on making that change. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Minister has mentioned, collaboration with Aboriginal organizations and women organizations within the Northwest Territories to get this work done. Can the Minister explain to me if they have a working group now with the Aboriginal groups, and who are they collaborating with outside the government right now on this plan? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Twin Lakes. Minister responsible for status of women.
Mr. Speaker, currently the interdepartmental working group I referred to includes departments of Health, Social Services, Justice, Housing, and We are working at looking at education, culture, employment, Indigenous affairs. So there are a number of interdepartmental departments working together. And the focus is to start to look at some of the doing our part, because we realize that a lot of our departments are doing initiatives and programs around the report. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister, oral questions. Member for Twin Lakes.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker. My question was, who outside the government have we been collaborating with? But I guess I'm not going to get an answer to that, because I want to ask if the minister can tell us if we can expect some type of plan presented in this House and we can begin to implement these justices to the 231 calls for justice. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Twin Lakes. Minister responsible for status of women.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the member wants to hold this government accountable for taking meaningful action with this urgency is required. I will commit to providing more regular reports to the member and offer the same to the committee. I agree that we need to continue to focus on this work and make sure we're moving forward with some actions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Tunade-Welde.
Mr. Speaker, just going back to my member statement, that community came together during COVID, and a lot of communities in my constituency, they worked together, and but in N.W.T they did do work to protect themselves because of the highway going in. And just to give a little context for the House, on a letter dated May 25th, 2020 from Madam Premier's office to my office, there was a request made for funding to fund the checkpoint going into N.W.T. And they did take the steps to protect themselves, and in my humble opinion, that's the N.W.T's job. They should be coming in and protecting our small communities. And further to that, in this letter, the letter stated that they will not fund this important safety measure, and for me, this is not okay. My question to the Madam Premier is, can she explain why this funding request was denied? Mr. Cho.
Thank you, Member for Tunade-Welde. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the reason that we had to look at it carefully and at this point have said no is because we have our own enforcement at the borders, Mr. Speaker. There are some liability issues. The municipalities do not have authority to do that. We haven't come down hard on them because we understand the fear that they're facing. So we're trying to support them, but we also have to recognize that that there are legalities with that. The other major thing that has come with that and the request for funding is that we have Municipal and Community Affairs has been collecting the debts, the monies that's spent by community governments on the COVID-19. However, the Canadian Association of Municipalities put in a huge ask for $10 billion to the federal government. So until we hear that $10 billion would be divided amongst all of the municipalities in Canada. So we're waiting for the federal government to hear if they're going to fund that, because it would be inappropriate. All along, the N.W.T has been trying to work with the federal government. So it would not be appropriate for us to fund a municipality here when they're already asking for more money and then having to figure out, how do we claw that back? What does that look like? So we are lobbying the federal government as well, that municipalities need money, but we're waiting to see if the federal government rolls out with that $10 billion bailout for the municipalities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for Tunde-Welde.
Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Madam Premier, for that response. And just going back to the letter too, there's a reference there that's a roadblock. It's not a roadblock. I said to the media before, this is like a checkpoint for, it's a self-isolation measure. Even though we have our security checkpoints at the borders, and I don't mean to point, sorry, but the people are still going through there, and they're still bypassing our 4 major centers where people are supposed to self-isolate, and they're still getting into the small communities. And there's these checkpoints in the small communities work. And I think, I guess for my next question, I guess just from hearing here, can Madam Premier commit to funding or even partially funding these checkpoints initiatives if the federal funding does not pan out? Asicho.
Member for Tunde-Welde, Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So some communities are working in partnership a little bit differently than other communities. Some communities are working with their Indigenous governments on their checkpoints. And the Indigenous governments did get money. They got money from the federal government for COVID-19 with flexibility on being able to use it. We want to help our municipal governments. It's not a matter of we want to help them or not. We do want to help them. So we are waiting for the $10 billion ask to see what that happens with. We're still collecting the debts from our municipal governments as well, and we're looking at other options. So we're actually looking with some flexibility, perhaps in the ECE program has a small community employment fund, so municipalities could look at adding that into their plans if they were willing to do that, and all departments, including ECE, have been very flexible during the COVID-19 to try to make sure that our programs meet the needs of people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for Tunde-Welde. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. As I mentioned in my statement earlier today, there's been little communication from Cabinet to regular analyze on what N.W.T is doing or not with regard to creditor protection proceeding on the Dominion Diamond group of companies. Can the Premier tell us when N.W.T began participating in the legal proceeding and what roles do we expect to play? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That doesn't go across all departments. It really is specified. So on that, I would defer the questions to our Minister of Finance. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister responsible for Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and actually it works out well to have those two roles combined in this particular instance. The Department of Finance does have the lead in terms of monitoring the CCAA proceedings and does work with Justice in terms of providing legal counsel and coordinating instructions to our external legal counsel and in partnership with ITI, as they of course have relationships with this industry more directly. So back to the member's question about when we got involved, Mr. Speaker, we do have experienced counsel involved on CCAA proceedings based in Alberta. We were notified of the filing on the day it was filed, and that's how we got involved, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that. The Academy Mine provides a substantial amount of revenue to N.W.T in the form of payroll taxes, property taxes, corporate taxes sometimes when it files in the Northwest Territories, mining royalties, carbon and fuel taxes, and more. Can the Premier tell us whether any of the Dominion Diamond group of companies have any outstanding liabilities to N.W.T and what are those amounts and types of liabilities? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, that is within the Minister of Justice's department, so I defer the question to her. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister responsible for Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, as I suspect many of the other creditors in the proceeding might still be fully compiling some of the data, we are in this no different of a position than many others in that regard. I can say that in 2019-20, the N.W.T did collect $14.6 million in terms of taxes. Obviously, I'm not sure if that's necessarily the same. With COVID-19, some of the reporting dates have been deferred and delayed, so that data is going to still have to continue to come in. And we do again have royalties that do come into us. Again, that reporting date was delayed. In addition to which, under regulation, Mr. Speaker, I'm unable to break apart the reporting of the royalties. They are reported in aggregate according to law. Mr. Speaker, there are just under $2 million in some general liabilities that are owed, some of which had been invoiced, but some of which we're still putting together. So there certainly are some risks in terms of what is owed to the N.W.T guarantee from the Dominion Diamond. But, Mr. Speaker, I would just note the CCAA proceeding doesn't mean that they would be unable to pay any of their liabilities to any of their creditors. Not to minimize the significance of the proceedings or the fact that we're monitoring them very closely, but it is simply an opportunity that we hope they will fully take to restructure their finances and be operational again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le President. I want to thank the minister for that, and I know I'm kind of skating close to the line here, but I do think that the public deserves to know what kind of liabilities are outstanding. I mentioned in my statement how N.W.T now holds $295 million in financial securities for the Acadie mine to ensure it's fully complies with its regulatory requirements around reclamation. I understand the Wekasee Land and Water Board is still conducting a review of parts of the third version of the interim closure and reclamation plan that was submitted in August 2018. But can the Premier tell us whether the financial securities for the Acadie mine are up to date and cover all the environmental liabilities at the site? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Actually, the question has to go to the Minister of Justice, unless she passes it on to the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, and I will certainly defer to you on the rules. I'm not quite there yet, but I'm happy to answer this particular question, Mr. Speaker. And yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm absolutely the securities that are required by the Land and Water Board are up to date, and we have every confidence that they are available to the N.W.T if they're needed. They are in accordance with the reclamation plan that was approved by the Land and Water Board. So I suppose, Mr. Speaker, that's all good news in that regard for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le President. I want to thank the Minister of Finance for that. I guess I'm not quite as optimistic because the plan is still under review. And until that's done and we get an up-to-date security estimate, I'm not sure it's fair to say that it is completely up to date, but in any event, for the first time I can recall, N.W.T accepted surety bonds as financial security at the Acadie mine. Mr. Speaker, insurance companies don't stay in business by paying claims. Can the Premier or the Minister of Finance tell us with complete confidence that the form of financial security, surety bonds from insurance companies, provide the necessary clarity and certainty to ensure full and final closure at the Acadie mine? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Short answer is yes, Mr. Speaker, but I would be naive to think that that's going to satisfy the nature of what is really being asked here. So surety bonds are a little bit different. A lot of times securities are held with what's called an irrevocable letter of credit. But in this particular case, these surety bonds are more like an irrevocable letter of credit than what they might be in some other circumstances. Most importantly, Mr. Speaker, the N.W.T has the ability to call on the bond if we had concerns about it. In addition, we have the ability, or rather, if in fact the bond were to be cancelled, again, different from what in many situations with a surety bond would be, the N.W.T has protection because there's notice of cancellation. And again, in such circumstances, the N.W.T would have the ability to call on the bond. Department of Finance takes it quite seriously. Department of Finance monitors these insurance companies. These are not small companies. These are very, very large companies. And just as much as we'd have confidence in a large banking organization, Mr. Speaker, we have confidence that these large insurance organizations are not going anywhere and that the bonds are secure. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following this House electing the Honourable Caroline Cochrane as our Premier, she gave a speech on October 18, 2019, where a number of commitments were made. One of them was that the Department of ITI would be renamed the Department of Economic Diversification and Development. Mr. Speaker, my question is, when can we expect to see that change?
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So those are conversations we started actually as a cabinet before COVID-19 hit. We were looking at all of our departments and how they fit, if they needed to be changed, etc. So it was an idea I put out here in my speech, but I also said that I'm open to feedback on it. In honesty, Mr. Speaker, due to COVID-19, that kind of got put on the back burner, but I do know that after this session, once we take a break and give our departments a break, because everybody has been going 24/7, we will be starting those conversations again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Premier, oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To be honest, I don't much care what the name of the department is, but I believe when the Premier makes a commitment, it's important that it be followed through with, especially if it's solely within her authority. Additionally, during that speech, the Premier committed to requiring a gender and equity-based lens be applied to any new program or service delivery in the N.W.T. When can we expect to see that implemented? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not going to take credit and say that because there's 9 women elected that we're doing that, but we are doing that right now. It was the right thing to do. Whether it be women or men in this House, it is the right thing to do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to hear that we're applying a gender and equity-based analysis to all new programs and service delivery. Perhaps the Premier could provide the regular MLAs of how exactly that is occurring. Additionally, during that same speech, the Premier committed to amalgamating the Department of MACA and Lands. When can we expect to see that change, Mr. Speaker?
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, those were conversations at the beginning. I did promise to have feedback from MLAs. Those are the conversations we will be having. I will not make that decision on my own. I don't think it's appropriate. I will be having conversations with our Cabinet, and then I will present to committee, the appropriate committee. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Final supplementary. Member for Yellowknife North.
Mr. Speaker, I'm quite confident that both the ministers of MACA and Lands would be quite curious to know if their departments are being amalgamated. So I look forward to the outcome of those discussions. Additionally, in that same speech following being elected as Premier, there was a commitment to mandate public surveys for all priorities for each department. Has that work been done, Mr. Speaker?
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will have to meet with the member after. I don't remember the commitment that I would ask for public surveys for every priority, so I will have to look at Hansard and meet with the member to understand what the meaning was behind that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in continuation of the questions posed by my colleague from Nunavut Twin Lakes, I'd like to ask some questions of the Minister of Health and Social Services today. One of the questions that was asked by my colleague was in regards to working groups and who our N.W.T collaborates with on those working groups. So what I would like to know is who outside the Government of the Northwest Territories does the Government of the Northwest Territories collaborate with on its working group for creating its action plan for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Health and Social Services works with a variety of organizations and NGOs, including N.W.T Disabilities, Status of Women. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister mentioned that the working group is currently doing an analysis on the calls for justice from reclaiming power in place. What is the deadline for this analysis? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at this time we don't have a timeline, and once we do, we'll let the member know. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the ministers mentioned before that we are national leaders in aggressive COVID-19 testing, and that we are national leaders in a very timely response to our response in reclaiming power in place report. I'd like to urge the N.W.T to be both an aggressive and a timely national leader in its action to do with murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. So will the minister commit to providing an annual report to this House on the status of its plans and timelines so we can be accountable to keeping all Northerners safe? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Camlake. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yes, the department will be looking at doing an annual report. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Camlake.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the minister's commitment. Mr. Speaker, I'd also like to know, when someone disappears, there is rarely evidence of that a crime has been committed. However, this is a prerequisite for police to seek the court's permission for a search warrant or for personal records to help their investigation. In the early hours after someone is reported missing, access to this crucial information can yield clues to the person's whereabouts held within their cell phone, computer, home, and more. A number of provincial jurisdictions have missing persons legislation, which can serve as a model for the N.W.T. So will the minister commit to bringing forward missing persons legislation in the Northwest Territories during the life of this Assembly? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Camlake. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have not explored this kind of legislation in Northwest Territories. It will require further research and consideration, as it will have a far-reaching implications. However, we are open to having further discussions on this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary. Member for Camlake.
That was 4.
Oh, sorry. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, today is the one-year anniversary of the tornado that hit the community of Fort Smith. And, you know, it was a very devastating event for a family in Fort Smith. And I just want to ask the Minister of Housing when the file is going to be concluded for this family in the community of Fort Smith. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, member, for your comments. This is an ongoing file that we've been dealing with. It's very unique. I want to provide information to the member. I would like to meet with the member. We don't have disaster funding within our department, but I'm willing to look at flexibilities for the service for the client, and I would look at this as an ongoing, but I would like to resolve this hopefully by September. I would like to put that date out there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have been going back and forth with the department, and I think that it's happened since I got elected in October. And I think that, bureaucracy is slow, and we have a member that had a very awful disaster in Fort Smith with a tornado. And it's a big concern for myself and for the family that's involved in that community. And a conclusion to this file is really important. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Didn't really hear a question, but I'll let the Minister respond. Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to express that the Housing Corporation did come out and we did provide assistance to the individual, but I'm looking at what further that we can offer for the disaster and for the unit that was damaged. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Oral questions. Oral questions. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's address. Replies to Commissioner's address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports of committees on the review of bills. Reports on committees on the review of bills. Reports of standing and special committees. Reports of standing and special committees. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Minister responsible for infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following 3 documents. Follow-up letter for oral question 45-19, bracket 2, Clecho All-Season Access Road Contract. Follow-up letter for oral question 85-19, bracket 2, Clecho All-Season Road. Follow-up letter for oral question 187-19, bracket 2, National Trade Corridor for Frank Channel Bridge. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Member for Mumfree.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table two documents, both addressed to the Minister of Industry, Tourism, Investment, and Education, Culture, and Employment. Mr. Speaker, the first letter dated June 1st, 2020 is from the Community Government of Bishopcone regarding cell phone connectivity between Yellowknife and Bishopcone Junction. And a second letter dated June 2nd, 2020 is from the Community Government of N.W.T regarding expansion of cell phone service along Highway 3 corridor. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Mumfree. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Member for Kamlik.
Mr. Speaker, I give notice that on Friday, June 5th, 2020, I will move the following motion. Now, therefore, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Nunavut Lake, that the Legislative Assembly recommend the reappointment of the following individuals to the Northwest Territories Human Rights Commission. Ms. Marion Burrows of the Town of Fort Smith for a term of 4 years, and Mr. Charles Dent of the City of Yellowknife for a term of 4 years. And further, that the Speaker be authorized to communicate the effective date of these appointments to the Commissioner. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Just a slight correction. I believe that's Tuesday.
Thursday.
Because tomorrow is day last, so we'll deal with it on Tuesday. Yes. Thank you. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Motions. Motions. Notices of motion for the first reading of bills. Notices of motion for the first reading of bills. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration and Committee of the Whole of bills and other matters. Table document 30-19 brackets 2 main estimates 2020-2021 with the Department of Justice and deferred departments summary pages. With member for Nunavut Lake signature.
I now call Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee, Mr. Norn?
Madam Speaker. Committee wishes to consider table document 30-19 sub 2 main estimates 2020-2021 and specifically the parts of justice, environment and natural resources, industry, tourism, investment, infrastructure, lands, municipal and community affairs, and the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Norn. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. We will take a short recess and resume with the first item. Okay. Call committee back to order. Committee, we have agreed to consider table document 30-19-2, main estimates 2020-2021, and we'll be resuming with the Department of Justice. The Minister of Justice has previously given opening remarks. Does the Minister wish to bring witnesses into the House?
Madam Chair, I do.
Sergeant at Arms, please escort the witnesses into the chamber. Would the Minister please introduce her witnesses?
Madam Chair, on my right is Charlene Doodle, Deputy Minister of Justice, and on the left is Mandy Bolstad, Director of Finance.
Sorry, Bolstad. All right, committee, we have deferred the departmental summary and we'll resume review of the estimates by activity summary, and we'll begin where we left off, starting on page 281 with information items up to 284. Justice service to government operation expenditures summary. I think we went through all the questions the last time, so we just need to call the page for this one, and then we can move on to the services to the public, if committee agrees. Okay, so Justice Service to Government Operations Expenditure Summary 2020-2021, main estimates $12,961,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. We will now turn to page 285, service to the public, with information items up to, I think it's, where are we? 287? Yeah, up to 287. Questions? Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Right now, if I want to look up a corporate registries document, it costs me $4. Can the Minister tell me how much in revenue the corporate registries online system makes us each year?
Thank you, Member. Minister?
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And sorry, if I could just clarify, it's the total revenue per year, is that correct, Madam? Okay.
Yes.
Madam Chair, I know we do, I don't have the breakdown here, but I suspect Ms. Bolstad likely does.
Thank you, Minister. Director of Finance, Ms. Bolstad.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the revenue under the land title and legal registries fees is just about $5.6 million total. So that's land titles and our corporate registries fees. I don't have the exact breakdown between the two, though. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Member for Yellowknife North.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I guess my issue is, I have no issue with land titles fees. Obviously, that is a fee, and I hope that office continues to charge them. My issue is specifically corporate registries, and very specifically the corporate registries online system. I guess I'll get to the point. It costs $4 to look up any corporate entity in the Northwest Territories. Most jurisdictions have waived this fee as an effort to transparency to see corporate records. corporate records, these are public documents. It's a principle of good open data and open government to not put things behind a paywall. Would a number of under $100,000 make sense for the amount of money we're actually charging to keep our corporate records behind a paywall? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
Well, again, Madam Chair, we don't have the specific breakdown. I certainly get it. And I think really what I'm being asked is whether or not we're going to look at whether we need to charge the $4 fee. So that's not something that I've had a chance to speak to the department about, but I can certainly commit to having a proper conversation with the department and getting back to the member or to this House about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That's exactly what I was looking at. I just think it would be one of these helpful transparency things if corporations' records were not behind a paywall, and I could go in and I could search any corporate entity and track their legal history, as I can do in most jurisdictions. Similarly, with the land titles office, at one point we were going to close down the land titles office during this COVID, essentially not allowing anyone to transfer real property. Can the minister commit to bringing land titles online so that they can conduct their business even during a pandemic? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I was just looking. My recollection is actually that those efforts have been made recently. Now, I'm not sure what the status of it is. This is the challenge of COVID-19, not being able to have my little whispers in my ear, but certainly in my past life, I know there was access to a lot of that information online. So. I'm not sure if there's something specific that the member wants to ask about what's not online.
Thank you, Minister. Member?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I believe there was some system worked out where people could email, and then some of the records were available online and some weren't. A lot of land titles, if you want to go in, is still done in paper. So I'm looking for a commitment from the minister that we can bring our land titles office digitally online. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
Chair, sorry, and so I think a lot of the services that are provided can be performed online, but there certainly are still requirements about the document passing back and forth that are still requiring papers to be filed. And so we have worked out a system where you can, drop something off in a Dropbox, but that certainly is far from being an online system. So that's sort of outside the scope of what I can speak to in terms of our budget right now. It's not in the budget for what that's worth, but as far as having a conversation, again, that may be one of the post-COVID-19 conversations that we are now going to have. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Member?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I guess I'll look forward to that conversation. I think if you can give the office marching orders to bring their systems online, and they'll tell you how long that'll take. If it takes a few years, I can live with that, but clearly it's something we should get started. Similarly, this is one of those weird sections of justice where we have our personal property registration, very underutilized system. We have regulations of securities trading. An expertise we struggle to have in the Northwest Territories. Can the minister update me if there is any thought to kind of combining these, specifically the personal property registration with Alberta, or any efforts to kind of work with our larger jurisdictions who hold the expertise? This is kind of a structural problem, and that I think the N.W.T has some responsibilities that we're perhaps not really capable of, or it's not a priority to have the capacity in. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member. Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Madam Chair, that certainly is a larger question around the structure and the function of the department. We are a small fry in some of these respects and in some of the tasks that are being performed in securities, for instance. That's not to say that we don't have some obligations, and I know some of those obligations are going to be legal obligations that we have to maintain these registries and legal obligations that we have to perform the function of registering securities. So, I think there are always a desire for efficiencies and conversations being had. How far they're going, I'm not sure. Perhaps what I might suggest, Madam Chair, let me start with a conversation with the member from Yellowknife North. But if there's a bigger interest in this area from the part of a committee, we can certainly have a conversation. I'm certainly happy to go to committee and sort of brief them on what is maybe a not as well-known aspect of the work that the Department of Justice does. So I'll start one member at a time, though. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I suspect I'm probably the only member interested in the regulation of securities trading, and I don't know if we... oh, sorry. I'm getting some looks. I'd like to speak briefly to the rental office. I understand the rental office is a bit of an arm's length organization, but I've raised previously with the minister some of these concerns in their ability to kind of make orders and address things more systemically. We had a briefing from the Human Rights Office, and they're kind of switched to this model, looking at more systemic issues, issuing, you know, kind of larger orders. A lot of the work came out of their act. Is there any plans to review the legislation that the rental officer operates under? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Madam Chair, right now, that legislation, I was just actually going back to double check where it might be landing in terms of on our legislative worksheet, but you know, certainly there were recent amendments to the Residential Tenancies Act just last year, so it likely isn't to be high in terms of a further review. That said, certainly in terms of the commercial tenancies and the residential tenancies, both of those pieces of legislation have been called to task, if you will, for their lack of modernity during COVID-19. So I certainly am now aware of that. Well, I was aware of it before, but more aware of it now. But I'm not going to necessarily commit to ratcheting it up the legislation timeline, other than to look at whether there's small tasks that we can maybe do. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is I'm getting down into the weeds in these sections because I have some very specific issues with them. One of my issues, as I've raised with the minister, is Land Title's office does not let you search by the name of a property owner. You have to find the lot address and the legal address and then find who owns it. I get there's some personal privacy issues, but what other jurisdictions have done is they've allowed all corporate-owned land to be searchable by name because those same privacy concerns do not apply to corporate entities. I, for example, would love to know how many properties Northview actually owns in the Northwest Territories. That's not public information. I'd love to know how many KingSett owns in the Northwest Territories. We have these large REITs that just keep gaining more and more property, and there's no public data. It's, you know, that's not publicly available information. I can't go to Land Titles and search it. Would the minister be willing to make the Land Titles office have the ability to search corporate entities by name? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, that you know, on its face seems like an easily solved problem. So part of me wants to simply give the easy yes. But at this point, again, I'm not sure if there's other pieces of legislation, either domestic to the Northwest Territories, that we would have to comply with. I don't know the degree to which there'd have to be you know, associated amendments and associated regulation change, etc. I just don't know the extent to which this is a problem or why it's the problem that it is. So what I certainly can commit to doing is finding out why it is that we have this system that is different. I don't know the answer to that offhand, but I can at least start there. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Are there any other questions from any members for services to the public? Member for Frame Lake.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. I know it's been raised in this House by members of the public. Sometimes the turnaround in the rental office doesn't always meet people's expectations. Has there been any assessment of the workload of that office and the resources that they have available? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I do know that those numbers, that the lag time between the filing of an application and the hearing date has been continuously dropping. And indeed, I believe as of February 2020, it was roughly at 5 to 7 weeks, which is an improvement over the last few years, certainly. And some of the initiatives that were undertaken in order to get there were around the fact that they don't need to conduct in-person hearings, and that certainly made it a lot faster. There's also been an attempt to increase the staffing, although I don't know that we're quite yet at 2 rental officers fully staffed at this point, though I can certainly confirm whether or not we have achieved that goal. So, you know, and again, there's always going to be a need to improve those wait times. 5 to 7 weeks is still a fairly significant time if you are, whether you're a landlord or a tenant. So, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Frame Lake.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Yeah, I'm looking at page 286, and I see that 2018-19 there was actually $292,000 spent in the office, and the budget for 2020-2021 is only $238,000. So there might have been some extra money spent in the 1 year. But can I get an explanation of what might on the surface look like a downward trend in resourcing? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so, Madam Chair, I know there is some variance as a result of the N.W. collective bargaining, but if I might, I'm going to ask the Director of Finance if there is any further information that we can provide to the member, please.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Frame Lake.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I'm not sure I'm the Director of Finance. Can I get the...
Sorry, Ms. Bolstad.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There has been no reduction in resources to the rental office. The variance there really is just from higher contract spending that occurred in the 18-19 fiscal years, and we had a similar trend in 19-20 as well. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Bolstad. Member for Frame Lake.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I guess some of this goes back to in previous business plans when we were doing them in that way. We actually had some performance indicators, some way of judging how resourcing levels affected level of service, and we don't have that for this particular service and entity. And I don't know, at some point we're going to have to look at how the gauging monitoring of access to services and turnaround service standards, times, whatever, is measured, and resourcing is appropriately allocated. But okay, I'll take the minister's word at it for now. The wait times have come down, but they probably still need to come down further. That's all I've got. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member. Minister, did you have any?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So, I mean, we certainly can provide the metrics in terms of the reduction in wait times. I mean, there's been reductions. Just I'm looking back to 2017, 2018, and that it's been by 22% to the 1 year, and then to 29% after that. But again, and that's the wait times is only one metric. That is influenced by the fact that there's now 2 part-time rental officers hearing that, so that changes the wait times, but it doesn't necessarily change, some of the other metrics of the service, wait time to a decision. So there are other ways of measuring the effectiveness of this public service, and perhaps we'll just, I want to be cognizant that it's also a judicial service, and sometimes measuring a metric can be a bit challenging on a judicial service. But I do take the point that when we're presenting this here and relying on public resources, we want to make sure we're showing as many metrics as we can about the service people are receiving. So, thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Tunaday-Willowday.
Yeah, Madam Chair. Just looking at a line item on page 286. I looked throughout the book, and a lot of the other departments have computer and hardware and software, and then they seem to have budgets throughout, and there's always some money there to maintain equipment and whatnot for computers. On this one here, there's from the actuals a couple of years back, there was $94,000 allocated, and all of a sudden it stopped. Is there a reason for that, Madam Chair?
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am going to send that one over to our Department of Finance, or to the Director of Finance too, please.
Thank you, Minister. Ms. Bolstad.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Department of Justice's computer and equipment is primarily purchased from TSC, but our systems are also were transferred to the ISSS. So although we had this one-time expenditure, it was just some equipment-related expenses in 18-19. We don't have any ongoing requirement for computer and equipment funding. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Bolstad. Member for Tunaday-Willowday.
Madam Chair, and thank you for that response. Just so I don't get ahead of myself, am I allowed to speak to the page ahead? Is that something to do with this? Okay, no, I just want to make sure. Other than that, that's only kind of number that I saw was out, so I have nothing further.
Thank you, Member. Are there any further questions to services to the public up to page 287? If seeing none, turn to page 286. Justice, Service to the Public, Operation Expenditure Summary, 2020-2021 main estimates, $4,497,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. We will now turn to the information items beginning on 288. So we have Justice Victims Assistance Fund, on 289, Justice Proceeds of Crime Fund, 290 and 291, we have Justice Work Performed on Behalf of Others information items. Do we have any comments or questions on these items? Member for Frame Lake.
Thanks, Madam Chair. On the Victims Assistance Fund, the accumulated surplus is growing. It's grown by $100,000 since 2018-19. And I'm just wondering if I can get a bit of an explanation there. I would have thought that we could find ways to better assist victims of crime by getting the money out. Can I just get an explanation of the increasing surplus there? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member. Minister?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Madam Chair, I can reassure the member, I think in this case, that while I don't necessarily know all the reasons why the past iteration of the committee might have been hesitant or in terms of their what they're funding, there's two things that are happening that I think are positive. One, the biggest one, is that the committee members have now met in person. They met in person November 25th, 2019. It was the first time they'd met in person in, I'm told, quite a long time. I had the opportunity to meet with them. They sat down. They were really brainstorming around where they want the committee to go. So as I understand it, that was an opportunity that has not existed for some time and should hopefully therefore support that committee to be working better and more proactively as a group. So that's a big part of it. But then and then another part is simply ensuring that the organizations that would be applying to this, that they would know again similarly that they have the ability and the opportunity to apply. I mean, I am conscious that it tends to be Status of Women, Native Women's Association, who are more than deserving, but there's likely other organizations out there. So the very fact of bringing some attention to the opportunity will also hopefully help with getting that money out the door. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Frame Lake.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks for that explanation. Is there like a cap or set by policy, by regulation, by legislation on how much can actually stay in the fund, or are there any guidelines on disbursement percentages or something? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member. Minister?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I believe there are. I don't know them offhand. Let me see if I may, Madam Chair, if you would check it with the Deputy Minister and see if she has that information available to her. If not, Madam Chair, then we'll certainly commit to getting it to the member.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the committee appointed by the Minister of Justice recommends disbursements from the fund to support community-based projects and activities that provide services and assistance to the victims of crime. And there's no cap.
Thank you, Deputy Minister. Member for Frame Lake.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Look, in no way am I going to suggest that these people are not doing their job. I think, as the Minister says, I think they get together like once a year or something to look at applications. So, whether the issue is it's not well enough advertised, what's available there, or whatever. But anyways, I'll probably ask these questions next year. So I hope to see the more of the money going out the door to help victims of crime. But I think that the Minister recognizes that there's an issue with a growing surplus, and she's going to find a way to make sure that we get more of the money out the door. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member. I didn't hear any question in there, so I'll take that as a comment. Member for Tabacha.
I just want to make a couple of comments. We were talking about the missing and murdered women, and I had a previous role when I sat on the National Capital Commission, and you know, this we have some surplus here, and I'm wondering if you know, a monumental plaque or a place of would come under a Victims Assistance Fund, with the missing and murdered women in the Northwest Territories were placed on a plaque and designated to the missing and murdered women. Is that possible? Is it something that has ever been thought about?
Thank you, Member. Minister?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I guess the answer really is whether or not there's an organization in the territories that might bring that idea forward. So, because the fund isn't one to which the Department of Justice can direct. That the Department of Justice, myself, we don't get to say to the committee what they should spend this money on. They're responsible for making those decisions. I mean, we have a lot of department support that we use to support the committee so that they can engage with communities, so that they can help the communities to develop programs, and indeed community justice helps directly with some of the community agencies. So if there's a community group or organization out there that wants to put an idea forward, then I would say please to go ahead and do that, and it'll certainly be evaluated. As far as I know, there's no reason why that couldn't come up as being eligible, but again, it wouldn't be up to me to make the final decision.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Tabacha?
Acknowledgement by the Government of the Northwest Territories is extremely important in this file. It's a way of acknowledging the missing and murdered women, and it's a designation that is would be unique. It shows us that we care. I'm not asking for it to go to a committee. I kind of, because I just saw the whole thing with the Victim Assistance Fund, and you know, a lot of families are still hurting from a lot of the whole events that took place, and justice hasn't been served. So you know, I want you to think about that as the Minister of Justice. I think it's extremely important that we acknowledge this. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Tabacha. Minister?
I disagree with anything that the member has said. It's just that I can't spend this money. I don't have the ability to spend this money. But obviously, the more we say it out in this House about these ideas, the more possibility that one of the community organizations could work with the Department of Justice and put forward a plan to do exactly as the member has suggested. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Anything further, Member for Tabacha?
Maybe it would be a good idea if the Minister did a bit of research on the way the National Capital Commission handles monuments and designations, and there are certain specifications that are required, and I think it's something that you could put towards your committee if that's what you know. I think it should be based here in the capital, because this is where the government sits, and I think that acknowledgement of the missing and murdered women on this anniversary is extremely important. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Member from Tabacha. Minister?
No, Madam Chair, perhaps, and really that's maybe a conversation that can also be had at Cabinet table too, so that's the point is well taken. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Anything further, Member for Tabacha?
Further comments?
Thank you. Are there any further comments or questions to the information items? Seeing none, I will... I thought I seen somebody's hand go up. Thank you, members. Please turn now to the department summary on page, I think it's 259. Yep, 259. All right, so Justice, Operations expenditures, total department, 2020-2021 main estimates, $133,617,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, Minister, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing before us. Sergeant at Arms, you may escort the witnesses from the chamber. All right, members, committee has indicated they would like to continue with the summary pages for the other departments. Does committee agree? Okay, members, we will begin with environment and natural resources on page 65. All right, environment and natural resources, total department. Operations expenditures, total department, 2020-2021 main estimates, $97,085,000. Does committee agree? Okay. We will now turn to infrastructure on page 223. Yep. Infrastructure, operations expenditures, total department, 2020-2021 main estimates, $275,029,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. We will now turn to lands on page 297. Lands, operation expenditures, total department, 2020-2021 main estimates, $23,364,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. We will now turn to municipal and community affairs on page 317. Municipal and Community Affairs, total department, 2020-2021 main estimates, $116,193,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. We will now turn to the information item on the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation on page 359. Housing Corporation, Northwest Territories Housing Corporation, operations expenditures, total department, 2020-2021 main estimates, $109,216,000. Does committee agree? Committee, those are the matters that we agreed upon to review today. What is the wish of the committee, Mr. Norn?
Madam Chair, I move that the chair rise and report progress.
Thank you, Mr. Norn. The motion is in order. The motion is non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Abstentions? The motion is carried. I will now rise and report progress.
May I have the report of the Committee of the Whole, please? Member for Nivik-Twin Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering table document 30-19, two main estimates 2020-2021, and would like to report progress. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder? Member for Sawtoo. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion's carried. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day for Thursday, June 4th, 2020, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, returns to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgements, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to commissioner's address, petitions, reports of committees on the review of bills, reports of standing and special committees, tabling of documents, notices of motion, notices of motion for first reading of bills, second reading of bills, consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters, table document 30-19-2, report of committee of the whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
Thank you. This House stands adjourned until Thursday, June 4th, 2020 at 1:30 p.m.